So how do you deal with a challenge? How do you deal with this challenge when effectively what we're about is managing a portfolio of community assets, assets of the water authorities, of local government, of communities that are subject to these major uncertainties and which particularly interact between the development of water services and the way that we develop our towns and cities in terms of their form. Now, the MAC modelling showed that in practice we can generate much greater value from a water cycle services approach by deferring large lumpy investments in the traditional water transport and logistics business. Because that's really what the water business is about. It's moving heavy stuff around, treating it and getting rid of it. The better approach, and I'm sure for those of you who've been in major businesses, any capital intensive business, there's huge value looked up if you can meet emerging demand by a more incremental and tailored approach to service provision and investment. From the point of view of the MAC work, we're talking about billions of dollars of savings that go directly to the issue about how much we all have to pay through our utility bills for water. Now, the work that we did suggests it's there for these savings are there for the taking. And those billions I've talked about are pretty much on the conservative side, because when we did the arithmetic, we didn't value avoided environmental damage, those better waterways that graph showed earlier. It didn't deal with the amelioration of flooding risk, and it certainly didn't try and value things like increased amenity. And we all know, I think we'd accept, that increased amenity, no matter how you might put a dollar value on it, we've probably got a fair feeling that it's not valued at zero, and it's certainly not negative. So that's why I say that the overall benefits of thinking in this way are really, really quite substantial. The other point to make, which particularly for those of you who are in the developer community or interact with them, is that this more tailored approach, and one which is more variegated, frees up what I might call opportunities for out-of-sequence development by the development community. And it does it at lower overall direct infrastructure costs, but more importantly, it reduces land holding costs to developers and ultimately home buyers. Some of the calculation that was done for the MAC suggested that if you end up being constrained by the way you develop, by waiting for the rollout of trunk mains and sewers, if that takes 5 years at current discount rates, it adds 50 to 80% to the cost of a lot. Now that means that goes straight onto the cost of a house, because ultimately we as house buyers are the people who pay the cost. Now, what I've shared with you in a relatively short period of time are some of what I regard as the fundamental drivers of why we could and should change the way we think about water service provision. Why now, and what will it mean? Well, I've already talked about the rapid growth of places like Melbourne, but there is also an issue of path dependency, of an arrow shot in a particular direction following a particular trajectory. So every development that does not embody design and practices that consider that whole of the water cycle that we're trying to promote effectively reduces the opportunities to defer that next major augmentation to the water, wastewater and stormwater system. And that will impose major cost on current and more particularly future generations. The cost of upgrading or building new treatment works, new drains, new sewers and so forth. And as I've said earlier, anybody who's been in business will know the huge value of deferring investment if it makes sense from a risk point of view. And we think we can manage that risk if we've got the right information. I think the other point, which is very clear from the video, and I think I'll be interested to hear what other people's views are, but people's attitudes generally have changed to water. I think they've ameliorated, the effect of the recent rains have probably ameliorated those changes a bit. But I think that millennium drought has brought a consciousness to people's minds about the way we think and value water, which is pretty important, and important in the way that we, in a sense, leverage off that. The next question is, do we have the means and ability to adopt that integrated approach that I've been talking about? And I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. We can build on the practical experience with integrating and planning in the management of potable water, stormwater, wastewater into our urban form, In our work to date, and we've not been around for very long, OLV is already working with the water authorities, identified about 150, 160 significant projects which are in operation or have been built, which address the issue of integrated water cycle management. And that's in Melbourne alone. And the indications are that there are more projects to come. And I'm sure that many of you in the room will know of some of these examples. And this is really good news from our perspective. So we can also build on the legacy of the centralised infrastructure that we've got and that has served us so well. We're not saying we're going to do away with nor ignore those very important social and community assets. They are very important. They have a very important part to play in our future. It's a very high quality system run by a group of very professional people. Again, I suspect, and I can recognise some of you from those organisations now. But we're going to build on that, as I say, and ensure that we place our bets in terms of investment in the most cost-effective way, using a mixture of tailored centralised and decentralised approaches. Now, I mentioned in terms of doing the right analysis to get to the right answer, and that's really something that's been, from a holistic point of view, missing across Melbourne and I think our towns and cities generally. And what's missing is a strategy that knits the whole together, that provides an overall story about how best to optimise the way that we plan and manage our water services and integrate it into the urban framework. The kind of strategy we're looking for, which we're actually in the process of developing, looks at all sources and uses of water based on a very deep understanding of different geography, population, climate and so forth. I think the thing that strikes you when you look at a place like Melbourne is just how different the north, the east and the south and the west of the city are. They all have different consumption patterns, microclimates, soil types and so forth. That presents challenges, but tailoring the approach to the particular area, which comes back to what we're talking about here this afternoon, offers huge opportunities to do the right thing in the right place at the right time. What we also need to do is account for all costs. Not just the cost of new projects, but the additional cost of upgrades and maintenance and the avoided costs of not investing in new projects if we can delay the investments that I've been talking about by being clever about capturing and using water. We then need to put all that, as I've described, infernal arithmetic together and come to a view about, from an uncertainty and risk point of view, what's the optimal approach. When you are faced with uncertainty and risk, what business practice will generally tell you is you're better to put small incremental bets onto the future rather than placing all bets on one particular answer. And that's really what I think integrated water cycle management in a nutshell is all about. That strategy I'm talking about, which we're in the process of developing for Melbourne, and we're going to work it with towns and cities across Victoria to develop, is something that needs to be rolled out, and it needs to be developed in a co-produced way with the community. Because fundamentally, at the end of the day, these are community assets. We are in urban environments where people, live, work and play, and if we don't get the answers right from the point of view of our communities, there won't be ownership of it, and in fact we'll make the wrong decisions. We'll be making them on a subset of what the right information should be. So the need for consistent and rigorous data, but also ownership, is very important. And again, I just lodge with you the idea that when we're looking at the various range of projects that you're going to bring forward to us through the RII process, thinking about how that plays out in your local community and how you engage in those conversations is an important part of the story from our perspective. First draft of the Melbourne strategy is going to go to the Minister by Christmas, and I think that will drive system-wide outcomes. And how we're going to do that is by setting performance targets of the sort which are of a fairly high level, but really quite demanding in terms of things like reduced potable water use, reduced runoff of the sort I've talked about there, the reduced nutrient loads that we put on our waterways and bays, and the control of impacts like salinity that can have very damaging impacts on both the built and the natural environment. Have we done this? Yes, we've done it. We've done it very recently with the new East Werribee precinct, which was co-produced between OLV, the local councils, the planning authorities, particularly the GAA, and a lot of developers who are going to be working in that area. Now, under the Living Victoria policies that the Minister talked about in the video, what we expect is this approach, this integrated approach to thinking, will become the norm rather than, in a sense, a bespoke or boutique activity. We will use performance targets to set high-level goals that individuals, organisations, developers, communities can then go about meeting in the way best suited to the particular locale that they're operating in. So it's very much about setting a high-level goal, but leaving the ingenuity and innovation and the local requirements to be met at that local level, developed in a co-produced way in the way that I've talked about. Now that will involve a lot of players playing together in a way which has not always happened in the past. OLV will have a role in Melbourne, people like GAA, obviously the water authorities, local government, will all have to support communities, developers and so forth to achieve these objectives. And our collective efforts will go to ensuring that this will at no stage limit one's ingenuity or the outcomes. It will actually build the opportunities and take the whole system forward, I think, in a more effective and efficient way. As I've said, that's a very important part of OLV's role. And really what we're about is to enable projects of the sort that I've briefly outlined to go forward to facilitate cooperation as the urban planning and water services systems migrate to this integrated approach. Now, is it going to be easy? Well, it's going to have its challenges. We're going to require careful attention to a wide range of policy, regulatory and quite practical nitty-gritty issues that we know already can constrain different stakeholders' ability to shift to an integrated and more innovative approach. We've been regaled with stories about that already in terms of perceived impacts that health regulations, that EPA regulations have on the ability to innovate. And we're going to be part of the system which actually works together with these kinds of entities, not to undermine the outcomes that the EPA or the Department of Health quite rightly have, but to understand what the real constraints are and to work cooperatively and imaginatively with people. Now, this is all reflected in OLV's first strategic plan. I think everybody might have picked up a copy or given a copy on their way through. If not, there are copies outside. I'm going to briefly run through this before I come back to the registrations of interest and the projects. There are really three themes that we're going to work on. The first one is integrate urban planning and water cycle management at that city and regional scale. That's the high-level story. It's the integrative framework that allows us to generate those performance targets I talked about. And each of these, there are priority actions. I won't read them out. You can read those at your leisure, and I think that's an important context for thinking about your expressions of interest. The second area is dropping down below that city scale, that regional scale. What we need to do there is get the right principles of integrated water cycle management, that multidisciplinary approach, embedded in the way that we design and construct precincts and buildings. And those are some important actions that we need to do in relation to the way that building regulations operate, the way that precinct structure plans are rolled out, and the way that referral authorities like water authorities feed their way in. And a very important element of that, which is item 4, which I'll come back to, is supporting projects that exemplify leading edge IWCM approaches. I'll come back to that in a minute. The third area is sharing knowledge, delivering common understanding. What does IWCM mean in practice? People use the phrase in probably different ways. We're going to do research, we're going to partner with research agencies, we're going to share knowledge, and we're also going to input into some of the regulations that govern the way that things like water authorities work. So that's a very high-level view of what our work program is over the next 3 to 5 years. And I've mentioned that those objectives are going to be delivered by these priority actions. Our approach to our work, again, which is laid out a bit in the plan, has got 3 elements to it, certainly from my perspective and our team's perspective. Transparency, openness and clear communication, which is part of what we're trying to do today. competition in ideas and respect for the diversity of different perspectives. If people come up with different viewpoints, particularly, for example, through the ROI process, but even more through other channels as we work with different agencies and stakeholders, we will listen very carefully to those viewpoints, and we'll be ready to be challenged and learn from that and share that learning. And the third area, which is really almost takes me back naturally to the Living Victoria Fund, is experimentation, learning by doing. This is the essence of what the fund is about, and we're going to use the fund to support that experimentation to get innovation and knowledge transfer across all key players in the sector, particularly at that critical interface between the way we manage and plan our urban environment and the way that we plan and manage our water services. Now, and I don't want to sound monetary about this, but we've only got a limited amount of money, so that does mean we're not going to invest in we're not going to put a huge amount of capital into projects that are going to go ahead anyway. One of the criteria that we always think about is the so-called additionality criteria. We don't want to use public money to just improve the profitability of an already profitable scheme. What we're thinking about as the fund is a form of leverage, in the form of oiling the wheels of a system which may not be operating at the interfaces of the different players in the way that's most effective. So it's about reducing barriers, regulatory barriers, spreading knowledge, and other things that will actually help people turn what might be a gleam in the eye into a really serious proposition. So I come back to priority 4 under objective 2. Again, this is in your plan. The why, well, why are we doing this? Why are we going to support projects? Well, because the dynamics we understand in the commercial development world don't always necessarily support innovation. Comes back to some of these issues around regulation and so forth. Water businesses, we know, in the way they work with their communities, face a range of regulatory and other barriers to getting up new projects, not least from their point of view of the profitability or the financial return on them. But there are other challenges in that area, and it's true for a lot of people who are trying to do this kind of work, local government and so forth. So, as I've said, we need to play an active role in this to actually support innovation, reduce risk, and prove the effectiveness of the new approaches that I've talked about. How are we going to do it? Well, that's why you're all here today. We want to identify and champion and support demonstration projects to promote that IWCM approach, and we're going to do it through grants, which is one part of the story. We're also going to do it through our power to convene discussions. One of the things I'm saying to our staff, and I'm saying to all our stakeholders, OLV does not have a lot of hard power. I can't point to a piece of legislation which says when the OLV says you must do something, you must do it. What we're is in the networking and influence game, but clearly money is an important part of that story if it's allied to the right kind of skills and approach as we use our various areas of influence and powers to convene conversations. And when are we going to do that? Well, Amanda will talk a bit more about it, but we are setting quite a cracking pace. We're actually asking you effectively to get your registrations of interest in by 21 January. I understand that that's not easy, but those registrations of interest, as Amanda will explain, are really quite skeletal. Why are we setting such a cracking pace? Well, if you like, it's trying to quickly get our arms around the size of the elephant. How big's the elephant? How big is the demand out there? What's the nature of the demand? What's the best way for us to play the game? Until we get that intelligence, it's very difficult for the organisation to really get a sense of what the possible opportunities are and how we can help. So the idea is that ROIs will identify those leading edge projects, and it will do it via this open competitive process. And so I'm saying to everybody, I'm encouraging people of yourselves like in the room and other people to come forward with any good idea that you think might well meet the objectives that we've talked about. And let me finish on that. The purpose of the fund, why the government wants to spend this money, why it's given OLV $50 million, as I've said, it's about sharing the risk of adopting a new approach. Any innovation tends to have a higher risk profile than the traditional business as usual approach, we want to share that risk with you. We want to look for design that's associated with a lead project of its type, the prototyping of new ideas. We want to work within the existing regulatory framework to actually promote change, because we do recognise that particularly the interaction of different regulators can at the end of the day make it all too hard. But also that feedback will help us work with the regulatory systems to see whether there are any ways that we can actually change it to make things easier. And importantly, we need to transfer the learning. So it's about monitoring and it's sharing the experience gained in what we're describing as exemplary projects. So that's the overall story of the why, the what, and a little bit of the how of the Living Victoria Fund. I'm now going to hand over to Amanda Cornwall, who's going to take you through more of the granular detail.